director, or possibly more than one named director. It has a producer or a number of producers. It has a fixed duration, only one value of that, and it has a number of famous actors that appeared in it. So an instance of a film is an object. Film itself is a concept which is represented by a class and doesn't have specific values associated with it. So be very clear about those two distinctions. The film is the prototype without specific values associated with it. A class is a prototype in general terms. The film anger management is an instance of the class film and is within a working system, is represented as a structured object, a structured chunk of data within your running system. How do you go about identifying classes? That's the first aspect of modeling with classes. So we've talked a little bit about what a class is, what an object is, the kinds of classes you might have. Now we need to just give you a little bit of advice on how to identify classes. Some bullet points here, and then as we go about looking at modeling, then so we'll also look at tools which help you to refine your class model and possibly add in additional classes, identify necessary additional places where you want to put some structured data. The key thing is to think about the general properties of the domain which you're working. And within UML, a standard approach is to write out use cases for it and then identify the nouns. Those are the things, the conceptual entities, and they can be of any of the types that I've mentioned earlier on. Those help you formulate the candidate classes. So simply going through a textual description of what you want to do, if you want to structure that as use cases, that's even more helpful. And then with a marker pen or a red pen, highlight or underline all of the nouns in there. They're not necessarily all going to be needed, and of those nouns you might remove some, and using some of the techniques which we'll talk about a little bit later, you might add in some ones. But typically a noun is an ideal candidate for a class. That gives you some candidates. So if you're talking to someone about an application supporting the publishing of books or the sale of books, a sentence that might come up in that conversation might be a publisher produces and markets a book. Another sentence might be a customer purchases a book, or an author writes a book. From that we've got straight away 4 classes. So if you do a little bit of highlighting in those sentences, then you'll come up with a diagram like this. No associations between them, a very flat structure to start off with, but we've got conceptual entities there picked out just by highlighting nouns, and all of them, as it happens in this case, are relevant to our application. A publisher, a book, a customer and an author, and they have certain properties. So we can start to think about the properties, and again, as you look at fleshing out the textual descriptions of what you want to do, you'll be able to pick out those properties. So a publisher will have a name, an address, maybe a website. The book, as you talk about what you do with the book, then the book number, the ISBN number, the title of the book, the unit price are going to be important. For the customer, their name, their email address, perhaps a shipping address. Again, similarly for an author, name, address, website might be useful properties to have for that. So what we've got are, again, abstractions. These are capturing information which at our level of working are important for publisher as an abstraction. So if we talk about a specific publisher, there might be some detail there which we don't need to know about. So we might not be interested in the length of time which that publishing house has been working. We might not be too interested about its history. We might not be interested. We might or might not be interested about whether that publisher is part of a larger organizational entity. So you need to make a decision about what information goes into that class, or whether there are other associations with other entities which need to be captured in that. That's your role as a modeler, as a practitioner of the art of abstraction, and it is very much an art. Very difficult to come up with very concrete science of this, but what we're about to start on now is a journey where we're putting the art of abstraction onto a slightly more scientific basis. One of the first things that we're going to have a look at is how do we link together classes. They're not going to work in isolation. They're going to interact with each other, and the associations between classes are what's going to be handled by the object relational mapping and mapped onto structure in the underlying back-end database. So we need to talk about that, and I'm going to give you a specific viewpoint on this which comes out of a particular way of working with objects, which goes back to some work which Schleyer and Meller were doing in the 1980s and 1990s to very good effect to help make class models more precise. So this isn't mainstream UML, but there are a number of good practitioners who follow this approach. You can be a little bit more casual about the relationships and the associations, but I would encourage you to follow the practice that I'm going to talk to you about. So an association, well, first of all, we can say in some sense a publisher and a book are linked together, and we can draw a line between those two things and say, well, a publisher publishes books, and a book is a publication from a specific publisher. So there are roles associated with that association. But we can be a little bit more active in saying what happens. So publisher and publication aren't actually that informative, because they're just variants of one of the words that's already present in that class. If we write active verb phrases, it gives you some stronger pointers to identifying precisely the nature of the relationship. So a publisher produces and markets a book. That's identifying some of the key activities which need to be undertaken by that publisher. The converse of that, a book is produced and marketed by the publisher. A rather simple converse, but sometimes you'll find the verb phrases on either end of those associations are quite distinct and a lot more informative. So there are some things you need to do. First of all, just for your own bookkeeping, make sure that you identify those associations. There's a value in that, because we're going to trace some routes through associations, and so naming the associations is helpful for that. But also we'll see one or two examples where there can be multiple associations between two classes, and so distinguishing between those associations becomes important. I'll come back to that later, so don't worry about it too much for now. But an unambiguous name. Make sure that the ends of those associations express meaning. So it should be either, the minimal is to capture a role at either end of those associations, preferably to use a verb phrase, which is a much more active statement of the responsibilities of a specific class in that association. So each class in that association has a role, and that gives a much more descriptive model. So if we look at a slight fleshing out of our previous class diagram, we should get to a state like this, where there are some active verb phrases. A book is sold to a customer. A book was written by an author. Then identifying very clearly the responsibilities in your model of those classes. There's something missing, of course, and if you're used to UML model, you'll notice we haven't said anything about the multiplicity there. So we need to include multiplicities. The role of the multiplicity is to identify the number of instances that can participate in each of those relationships, the domain relationships. UML, in its general sense, allows you to put specific numbers on multiplicities. So it could say, for example, and I'll use this as an example, it could say that for some reason in your domain model you've said that a publisher could publish 20 books. And that might be because you've talked with a particular publishing house and they've said, well, because of the way a business runs, then the most we can ever publish at any one time are 20 books. So if we get a new publication, we have to withdraw an old one. UML allows you to do that. Just because it allows you to do that doesn't mean you should do that. So what I will do is recommend you use only 4 kinds of multiplicity. And there is a really clear reason for doing that. One is that as soon as you start putting specific numbers on multiplicities, you're tying yourself into a particular design decision. So you might say a car has 4 wheels, for example, and if you were a motor racing fan of a few years ago, that would have mitigated against Ken Tyrrell's for a short-term innovative solution with 6 wheels. And there might be other reasons why you would want to change that multiplicity. So when you're modeling the domain, you want to look at what is physically possible, what are the physical constraints, not what are the design constraints. You can put those in later, but in modeling the domain, stick to just 2 general kinds, unconditional and conditional, and of those, whether you have a fixed number of 1, sometimes that is a requirement. So a book can only have 1 publisher. It doesn't make sense for them to have 2 publishers. But a publisher can publish 1 or more books. You might have conditional ones where a book in a library may or may not be represented on the shelves. So the book on the shelves could be 0 or it could be many. Sometimes you might have a 0-1 conditional, so that an association may or may not be present. Let's look at that on a on our particular example.